So today's lesson is about ecological pyramids. It's a different way of representing a food chain rather than just a line. We're showing it as a pyramid where we represent some quantity about each organism that's part of the food chain. Now we can't represent a food web with a pyramid as easily. This is sort of based on more of a linear structure. The first type of pyramid we'll talk about is a pyramid of numbers, and its name tells you exactly what you're going to see: the total number of each organism in a food chain. So we're literally counting how many of each organism are there. The producer numbers are always placed at the bottom, and then we'll move up the food chain until we get to the top carnivore numbers. So a very typical pyramid of numbers would have, like I've illustrated here, producers on the bottom, followed by your primary consumers. So there's a C and a 1 representing primary or first order consumers. They're the herbivores because they're eating the producers. Then your primary carnivore, the first one that is eating another organism, not just a plant. Then your third order or tertiary consumers, which are your secondary carnivores. And we could keep on going. There could be several different levels of consumers. Now you'll notice that the pyramids on the right, those pyramids with the pictures inside, don't have any decomposers necessarily, because we don't always represent decomposers, but they both have the same set: producer, herbivore, few carnivores until we get to the top. The one that's on this side is based on a land ecosystem, and the one that's on the right is based on an aquatic ecosystem, just to illustrate that we could do this with any type of food chain, as long as we have a producer and then some consumers that follow it. Now the picture on the left looks a little different. A, it's flashy green, kind of looks like throw-up green, but B, it has this, a weird small looking level that doesn't seem to follow the pattern of the rest of the pyramid. Now, even though this is not technically upside down, the term for this type of pyramid is inverted. In an inverted pyramid, a level that's near the bottom is smaller than the level that comes after it. It could happen with a producer, it could happen with a consumer, but the terminology is to call it inverted. Normally, the shape of the pyramid would follow like these two, where each successive level gets smaller and smaller and smaller if we were to count the number of organisms. In this particular example, we have a really large producer. So here's our willow tree. When you have a really large producer, that means that one producer could feed a whole bunch of consumers. And so we see a problem with representing things with pyramids of numbers. They don't always represent what's really happening because, like in the case of a willow tree, one tree could be supplying thousands of small invertebrates. Here we have caterpillars. So when we have a pyramid that starts out large on the bottom and gets smaller and smaller and smaller, we call that an upright pyramid, meaning each successive level is smaller than the one that came before it. An inverted pyramid is when we have this type of scenario. It doesn't have to be at the producer level, but that's often the example that we discuss. So this happens when we have a really large producer, or we could put or organism. It doesn't have to be the producer. So it doesn't work to always count how many organisms there are. So what's another way that we could represent a food chain with an ecological pyramid? Well, we could try something different. We could try a pyramid of biomass. This should get rid of the problem of not accounting for the fact that one organism could be very large, because now we're not going to count how many of them there are. We're going to measure what the mass is. That should get rid of that problem. So here's an example of an upright pyramid of biomass. We have our producers. We have some herbivores, so we've got a moose and a rabbit. We have our primary carnivores and our top carnivores. Now in this one we have one less level than in the last one, so remember the number of consumers that you have, consumer 1, consumer 2, consumer 3, can vary depending on the particular food chain and how many of each organism there are, and thus how much their biomass is. Now a pyramid of biomass illustrates this topic of biomass. So what is that? Biomass is technically the dry mass of living organisms. So you guys will be doing a little activity where we calculate the biomass of the HTA football field. But biomass is the dry mass that we would measure typically in grams per meter squared. So that would be its mass. That would be the area. So we would pick a defined area, and in that area, figure out the mass of all of the organisms. Now, obviously, this would not be as easy of a measurement to take as simply counting organisms. There's a moose. There's another moose. Now we have to get into a lot more detailed observation and more detailed data. If we're able to collect this data in a pyramid of biomass, these are some sample numbers. I have 1,000 kilograms of producer, 100 kilograms of primary consumer, 10 kilograms of secondary consumer, and then just 1 kilogram here at the top of tertiary or third order consumer. So notice the biomass decreases each time we go up a level. Just like with the other pyramid, producer biomass is placed at the bottom and the top carnivore is placed at the top. Now what happens if we have an inverted pyramid? Well, here's a really good example of an inverted pyramid of biomass. In particular, in an aquatic food chain, our producers could possibly be phytoplankton. If we look at the word phyto and plankton, phyto is referring to light and plankton is the type of organism. So phytoplankton are producers. They're performing photosynthesis. They're absorbing light. And then we have primary consumers, zooplankton. Now the zoo part is referring to animals. That's why a zoo is someplace that you find animals. And they're consumers. And here's the scenario. Phytoplankton, if you take a look at this example, have a really, really, really small biomass. It's not because there's not a lot of them. There are a lot of them. But almost 100% of their structure is water. So when we take away the water and we measure the dry mass, there's basically nothing left. So this is an example where the mass, the biomass of the producer would be smaller than the biomass of the primary consumer. Most of the time, in an aquatic food chain, this would be a really typical pyramid of biomass where the producers have a huge biomass. There's just tons of them. So the top example is a Florida bog, and the bottom example comes from the English Channel. Now the third type of pyramid is a pyramid of energy. And a pyramid of energy, like it says here, is always upright. Now I don't care how many of the organisms there are. I don't care what their mass is. So we're going to get rid of all of the issues we had that were making us have an inverted pyramid. And we're going to only talk about energy. When we talk about pyramids of energy, we're talking about the total energy in the population of the organism in each trophic level. The producer energy is placed at the bottom, and the top carnivore energy is placed at the top. Now this is fantastic because I don't care how many organisms there are. I do not care what their mass is. I simply care how much energy is available. How much energy are they providing? So for example, I might have 5,000 kilojoules here, 500 kilojoules here, 50 kilojoules here, and 5 kilojoules there. So this is just a reminder that joules are the base unit for energy. Now typically when we're talking about the energy of a whole food chain, we would have something bigger than just a joule. A kilojoule, kJ, represents 1,000 joules. Now, unlike perhaps the physics unit of Science 10, where you had to do a bunch of calculations with energy, that's not really our point. I'm not going to ask you to use a formula to calculate energy. I just want you to recognize that that's the unit that we're going to measure it in. The key thing here is that each level cannot possibly have more energy than the one that came before it. It would be impossible for example, this level to have more energy than that one. And the reason is the first law of thermodynamics that we saw just a few days ago. I cannot make energy from nothing. Energy always has to come from somewhere else. So if I'm already at the second step in my food chain, I'm at the consumers, they're not doing photosynthesis anymore. Where could they possibly be getting their energy from? It has to come from the producers. That has to be their source of energy. So because of that, there's no way that I could have an inverted pyramid. So it's always going to be upright. Now, how do I know how much is passed on? Well, if you saw in the biomass example and in this one I just did, it looked like I was dividing by 10 each time. And that's the basic rule of thumb that we're going to use. When we're looking at a pyramid of energy, here are some considerations. At each level of the food chain, some energy is always lost. Now we know it's not really lost, that's why lost is in quotes. We call it lost because it is unusable. The next level of the food chain cannot access that energy. So you know, for example, that every time a muscle contracts, a little bit of heat is created. Every time cell respiration occurs, some heat is created as a byproduct. Every time decomposition happens, some heat is created. So we know that there are several biological processes that an organism has to accomplish to survive that produce heat. That heat is not getting passed on when they're eaten by another organism. The second thing that happens, organisms use some of the energy. So let's say, for example, that I eat 1,000 joules worth of food. Well, I'm going to use a whole bunch of that to do things like move, breathe. So in this section, body functions, you need to ask yourself here, how many different functions does an organism need to perform? So for example, movement, reproduction, and the production of waste. Those are all vital processes that organisms need to perform. Now the third thing that happens to energy is some is released with waste. So you know what some examples of waste are. For example, urine or feces, your breath, your sweat. These are all examples we've seen in the chapter on excretion, on digestion, on respiration, where we're producing waste. And some energy is always leaving with waste. Therefore, so because of all of those things, not all the energy of one level is passed on to the next. And like I said, the standard number used is 10%. Approximately 10% of the energy from one trophic level is available to the next level. So you'll notice over here, I wrote, you just divide by 10 each time. To divide by 10, you take away a 0 or you move the decimal one place. So I'll show you another example that's going to involve some decimals. Let's say I have 425 kilojoules down here. That would mean I have 42.5 kilojoules here. See how I just divided by 10? I took the imaginary decimal, which was right here, and moved it one spot. This line would be 4.25 kilojoules, and the very top would be 0.425 kilojoules. You're just dividing by 10 or moving the decimal one place each time. Now, what's the result of all of this? This fact that all of the energy is not available? There are a couple of limits. There is a limit to the number of trophic levels. There's a point where there's not enough energy to support yet another level above the one that's at the top. The other thing is that at each level, there's a limit on the number of organisms and or their biomass. So only so many organisms can be supported by the level that came before them. This is showing how populations interact with each other and how changing one level, one trophic level of a food chain could have an effect on another level. Now the last thing is an example that comes out of your textbook. It's on page 27 and it's number 10. Now it involves a little bit of math, and so I'm just going to show you the steps that we would go through to do the math so that you can see the answers that we got. I'm not particularly concerned with doing the math. It's not something that I'm going to ask you to do in great detail on a test. What I am concerned with is the result of the question. So in the question, it says that we are in 1 square kilometer, that's how much grain we're getting in a year. The grain produces a certain amount of energy per kilogram. A cow has this average mass, needs 7.7 kilograms of grain every day. A person needs this much energy, and beef contains 13,900 kilojoules per kilogram. So this is all data, fictitious data. You don't have to memorize this. We're just trying to illustrate a point. Now, if I were to answer part A, how many cattle are supported? The number of cattle that are supported would be calculated by figuring out how much grain a cow needs each day, and then how much grain the field is producing. So we know in the field, so we have this much per cow. We also know that in our field, we have 300 tons for every kilometer squared, and that's how much I actually have. So I'm just going to take those two numbers and I'm going to divide them. So I'm going to do 300 tons, which is actually 300,000 kilograms. I'm going to divide it by 7.7 times 365 days, because that's how many days there are in a year. And that's how I'm going to arrive at 106. Now my answer is actually 106.74, but I can't have 0.74 of a cow. That's not a thing. So I round down. And in general, when you have living organisms, you round down because you can't have 0.2 of a cow. Now the next two questions are about people. And we're going to calculate how many people could survive if they ate grain versus how many people could survive if they ate beef instead. So for the number of people supported if they ate grain, we know, based on the values given to us, That's how many kilojoules per kilogram grain is providing. There are 300,000 kilograms of grain in a year, and we're going to divide that by the number of kilojoules a person needs a day and the number of days in a year. Now, if we do that, that's how we arrive at the 48,595. So an entire city could survive off of this if what they ate was grain. Now, how many people could survive if they ate only beef? And we're assuming only beef here, not beef and a bunch of grain as well, but only beef. We decided there were 106 cows. We know that each cow weighs 500 kilograms. We know that beef contains 13,900 kilojoules per kilogram. So we'll multiply that together and then divide it by the number of kilojoules a person needs times the number of days in a year. That's how we got 840. So again, the details of the calculation are not the most crucial part. What is crucial is that we look at what the answers are showing us. 106 cattle are supported. If people ate grain, a whole city could survive. If people ate beef, 840 people could survive. So what we're asking is, what seems to be the more efficient use of farmland? And if we're looking from strictly an energetic standpoint, so we're not talking about any other factors, but we're thinking just about the amount of energy that is available, it makes way more sense to grow grain. Now, an argument like this, or a set of calculations like this, is often used to support the idea of vegetarianism. A lot of people support vegetarianism, not just because they don't want to eat meat, but also from an economic, sort of energetic standpoint. If we just ate grain, well, we could feed more people on the planet. We might be able to reduce the number of people who are growing hungry. So this is sometimes used as support for an argument that everyone should be a vegetarian.